Today we're going to go through the SpecBIM tool for version 5 of Specsources. SpecBIM is a plugin for Revit, and its primary goal is to pass information from Revit into Specsources. And you'll find it here once it's installed in the add-ins section. And so you don't have to start with SpecBIM or start with Specsources. You have to at least have a project set up in Specsources before you start using SpecBIM though, so you have something you can point the data to. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into Specsources here, and I'm going to create a new project. And I'm just going to call it SpecBIM Test Project. And you're going to set your office and your client type first. And you don't have to have specs written or really do anything else with this project. You just have to have it set up so there's a place to pass information to from Revit. So now I'm going to go back into Revit. And this will work for any version of Revit from 2009 to 2020. And it will, when you go to install the software, it'll ask you what versions of Revit you want to put the Specsources menu in. So the first thing we're going to do, and it's the only option right now, is we're going to click Setup. And this is kind of the screen that has the most going on. We've tried to make this tool really easy to use. There's not a lot of buttons to click, but this is like the most daunting one, but it's really not that hard to use. So we're going to start right here. We're going to select the project that we want to pass the Revit data to, and I'm going to select SpecBIM Test Project, and that's the one I just created. If I already had spec sheets and Specsources, I'd see them listed here, but I don't, so there are none. Now this next section is used if you have models where the rooms are set up but the furniture is in a different model, and you can select those from here and link to those so that you don't have to have the furniture in the same model as the rooms are set up, which some firms do. Here I'm just going to leave them blank because I don't have it set up, but if you did have those, you could select those there. Now below, this is where you're going to map Specsources fields on the left to Revit parameters on the right. And so our control number, which is our item number like CH1, CH2, it's going to ask us, where do we want to get that out of Revit? And you can choose any of these. You can type mark as the typical location for it, but you could say, you could use any of these others. You can use free text, have a custom parameter or a type parameter here. But normally, I'd say 99% of our clients use type mark. And so you're just going to put the control number in the type mark field. Materials, those are typically pulled out of keynotes. I'm not going to go into materials on this demo, but you can pull those over and then calculate them based on the area or the volume of the space and bring those into Specsources also. Now below, we've got area and location. And remember, in Specsources, areas are big spaces like a floor or a level or a department, and then locations are within that area. And so areas are typically going to be mapped to level or to department, or again, you can use custom parameters here if you've got a model that's kind of set up differently. And locations are typically going to be mapped to room number and name, but sometimes people want to use just room name and room number. It's up to you. You can make a change to these selections on the fly. So once you've created a project in Revit, if you want to change this from room number and name to room name, you just come here and change it, and it'll update it automatically within Revit. And then when you pass that data to Specsources, it will update. Now you can write your spec or put labels for your spec within Revit here by saying select Revit parameters, and you can select from parameters here that you want to pass to Specsources. I would say very few people do that. Normally, you're just going to be using Revit or SpecBIM to pass the area, locations, and quantities into Specsources. You're not going to be using it to, you're going to be writing your spec in Specsources using our templates. Families and models. Specsources is going to track furniture and system furniture families by default. But you can select any other family you'd like in here. You can select specialty equipment or lighting. Whatever you check here, it's going to track that family and allow you to bring that information into Specsources. It's up to you, any of the Revit families that are part of this project. Scan for linked models, I'm typically going to have that checked. Scan only primary design option. If you're using design options, which allows you to create different versions of a room, this will scan only for the primary one, only the one that you're using at that moment. If you uncheck this, it's going to bring over quantities for all those different design options, and that can get a little messy. So And then scan main model should pretty much always be checked. So I'm going to say OK, and we're going to see the menu open up here. And so the next thing we're going to typically do is we're going to say sync data. And I'm just going to show you this grid real quick. This is where it's going to pull in all of the information from the Revit model. And so I've already got my type mark assigned and put in these item numbers in the type mark. Let me show you where you do that. You just click on the item here, hit edit type, and then we're going to scroll down, or right here, type mark. You just put in whatever type mark you want to add for that item. That's your control number. Now the thing you have to know is that that prefix that you're using has to match what's in Specsources. So you have to have a CH prefix set up, or when you go to pass that information over, it won't find it in Specsources and it won't pass it, because we won't know what item type to put that item into when that information passes over. As long as it's set up, we'll know that CH equals seating or chair or whatever you've got set up in Specsources, and it'll pass that data across. But you've got to have these match. If I just put C in here and I don't have C set up as an item type in Specsources, it won't pass over. So let's go back to the sync data and take a look at this grid. This is all the furniture that we're tracking here. And so it's going to bring over the control number, which is mapped to type mark. It'll tell you below where it's mapped. You've got a preview image, that's your object in Revit. And then you've got your family name, phase, it's going to put that in here also, design option, areas, locations. And then on the far right, this little find will find that item within Revit. This is telling you that we're tracking it. And on the right, this is telling you this item is in Revit, but it's not in Specsources yet. We have not passed that information over. So it's just sitting in Revit waiting to get passed and updated to Specsources. Now the other nice thing about this grid is you can drag any field you'd like up here to do counts and to kind of look at your data and make sure everything's the way you want it. So I just drag the control number up, and then I can click here and see CH01. I've only got one of them in the project. Or CH02, I've got 5 of them. And then I can look here and it'll tell me, you know, where the item is, level 1, 0 office. Basically every line that you see here is going to represent one item within Revit. The count's typically going to be 1. You can limit the grid by areas here, by locations, and then if you've got multiple files linked in, you can look at just particular files here within the list, which is really nice. So I'm going to leave this grid for a minute. The other thing you can do, by the way, is you can drag any field up here, or multiple fields. So I could bring up area and location and say level 1, 10 lobby. This is my furniture in the lobby here. And so you can bring any field up there to kind of validate your data for yourself. But I'm going to leave this right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about room types. So what room types do is it allows you to assign a room type to a particular room that an item is in. And so the other thing you can do here is you can create a virtual copy. This does not get used a lot. I'm not going to go into it on this demo, but say you've got one room with 5 pieces of furniture in it. You can create a virtual copy and then put that same furniture in 50 other rooms without having to put the objects in those rooms. But most people still want to have the objects in every room, but you do have the ability to do that here under Create Virtual Copy. But under Assign Room Type, this is going to allow you to put a room type in to tell room 1, room 2, room 3, what kind of room type is that? Is that a king room? Is that a queen room? So we're just going to click Assign, and all you do is you just type right here in the space. We'll just say this is king room type 1. And then under the ID, we're going to give it just a real short abbreviation. And that's going to help print in the reports when it passes to Specsources. And so I'm going to put king room type 1, that's K1. Now there's a button at the top that'll check for room type inconsistencies. So what that's going to do is if you've got a chair, you know, and a desk that's in a king room type, and then somehow you've got that assigned differently in another room where you've just got a chair, it'll tell you there's an inconsistency within those room types because the same furniture has to be in every single room type. And I can click Show here, and this will show any furniture that's within that room type. I don't have anything for that one room. Let's do the lounge here. Let's do this office. We'll assign a room type. Let's just say this is, even though it's an office, I'm going to call it a queen room. I just say OK, and that'll assign it. And then if I've got items within there, I can see the items that are going in that room. So anytime I've got items assigned to a king room or a queen room, I have to see the same items in every room here. You've got to make sure that everything's set up right within your model. And so we're going to close out of there. And so now if we go back to the sync data grid, we can scroll over here. You'll see that we've got a room types column because we've assigned room types. And I'm not sure why those room types aren't showing up there. I probably did something wrong, but we'll come back and take a look at that in a sec. Let's take a look at that and see why that didn't do that. Oh, you know what? I didn't hit the apply button. That's my fault. That is a user error. So let's try this again. We're going to select a room type. We'll just say Queen Room 1. OK. We'll hit apply. And now when we run our sync data, we'll see we've got our queen rooms assigned to some items here. And now the fun part is when we're going to pass this information into Specsources. So again, if you do not have existing spec sheets in Specsources, if you don't have a CH02 or a CH03 spec written, it will create blank spec sheets within Specsources with the proper areas, locations, and quantities with that item number. If you have existing spec sheets with that item number, it is just going to pass over the areas, locations, and quantities and update those. Now, the first time you pass these over, you're going to have the option of passing over the picture and also the family name, the Revit family name you can pass over as a placeholder, because if those specs don't exist, you might want to see something other than the word pending in the family name, in the item name in Specsources. And so the Revit family name will pass into our item name field, and this preview image will pass into our image field. There are options, though. You don't have to do that. And so those two options are here at the bottom. The top 5 selections here you really don't want to mess with. They're really only used for really weird, not weird, but custom situations. But on the bottom, we can decide to pass the Revit family name over and pass the Revit thumbnail over into our image field. If you already have an item name in an existing spec, or you already have a picture in an existing spec, it will not overwrite those. So it's going to assume that what's in Specsources for the picture and the item name are correct. But this is only for new spec sheets, for blank spec sheets. That's going to do that. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to select the items I want to pass over, and I'm just going to use my Shift button, or I can use Control, and I'm going to select my seating, my CH01s, 02s, and 03s. And again, we've made this really easy. I'm just going to say sync selected data, hit proceed, data syncing complete. So we're going to go back to Specsources, and I'm going to hit the refresh button. And all of a sudden, this was a blank project. I've got items in here, CH01, 02, and 03. So I'm going to click on CH02, and when I go to look at my item name, I've got a Revit family name in there, which I can edit that. I can make that, and I can change that and just say this is really just a Knoll lounge chair. I don't need that other information, and I'll update it. My areas and locations will all come over from Revit, so that item is in Queen Room Type 1, Level 1, 8 Office. And I might have multiple places that that item is assigned to. And then if I've got a picture in for that item, I will see the picture here, but I can replace that with a picture that I've already got in Specsources. And next time I pass that information, it won't overwrite that. It'll keep the original picture there, which is really nice. And so that's the basic gist. That's going to pass over areas, locations, and quantities. Now there's one other feature that's brand new. We're going to go back to Revit here. And this is export room PDFs. So what this is going to do, it will allow you to pass over areas, locations from Revit. Once those are passed into Specsources, you can bring over a PDF from Revit that will show you the key plan, which is where the room is within the Revit model, and it'll also bring over the room plan with a room quantity. And so let's choose one of these that I know we have some items in, 7 Lounge. I'm just going to check this, and I'm just going to say OK, and that's going to pass over the PDF when I do that. Now, if you check all of these and you've got a big project, it's going to take you a while for that information to pass. If it's hundreds of rooms, I mean, you can go to lunch and come back because it's got to generate those PDFs and pass them. And so you may not want to do them all at once or do them at the end of the day. So I'm just going to say OK. Down here on the left, you'll see the status, exporting room level 1, 7 lounge. Takes a second because it's generating all this information out of Revit. And there we go. And so we're going to go back to Specsources. I'm going to go here to Areas and Locations. And under level 1, you'll see under 7 lounge, I can now view the room plan PDF or view the key plan PDF. I'm going to select it here, and I'm going to print it all on one report. So I can generate a report, and again, this is all coming from Revit, but it's a nice way to see what's in the rooms and make sure everything matches what you expect. And so on the left, I can zoom in a little bit on this. I've got my room plan on the left, my key plan on the right showing where that item is, and then below it's showing the items that are in that room. And again, you can pass that over. When you go to print project in Specsources, when you print by location, you can generate that report and it'll print as part of your spec book when you go to print project and print by location. And that is pretty much the SpecBIM tool. These other two items don't really get used hardly ever. I'm not going to talk about them in the demo, but that's how you pass information from Revit to Specsources. Thanks.